The jungle. The wind blew through the trees with a soft touch that made the leaves whisper in the night. The trees in the jungle stood close to one another, creating a dense fortress that was impossible to navigate. The sound of small streams running nearby was the only sound he could hear that night. Strange, he thought. Normally the bugs are out by nightfall. Dave had been asleep most of the day. It was unbearable here. Humid weather stuck to his skin like a wet shirt, clinging to him, making daytime activities impossible. So he would wait for nightfall. That was his best chance to move around without worrying about the sun beating down on him. The night would offer the chance for some cool breezes, making the challenging terrain easier to navigate. He arrived in the jungle a few days back on an expedition. Dave was searching for a new species of primate that a wildlife photographer had snapped a picture of. Normally, Dave would have brought his field crew with him, but 3 days before the trip was supposed to launch, he called them all to tell them that he had decided to leave early for the trip. Although the team was puzzled, they agreed to Dave's choice. Dave was known to be an adventurous man, so it did not strike anyone odd that he would want to go on his own. "Well, let's head in. New apes don't just find themselves," he said to himself, chuckling as he stood up. Clicking on his headlight, he pressed into the dark jungle. The ground was wet and muddy. Each step he took was accompanied by the sound of his boots slushing through the ground. Navigating the jungle at night was tough, even for an experienced explorer like Dave. He would leave markings in the trees to create pathways to follow back to his camp. Dave had set up camp in a small clearing that he had found in the first day of his expedition. The site was small, but well prepared. He was no rookie to this. Dave was well known in the scientific community for braving various environments, finding what they said could not be found, and blazing new trails. A true visionary in his field. The camp consisted of his tent, a small fire pit, and a locked storage for all of his supplies. His site was well organized. Dave liked to know where everything was and kept his things in their place. This allowed his trips to be more efficient. Dave pressed on through the jungle, brushing past vines and looking for the markings he had made the previous few nights. Each night he would trek a little farther into the trees to try to find his prize. He paused for a moment. As he tuned into the deep unknown that was this jungle, he was stunned. No sound but the wind in the trees. Still. This was odd. The nighttime usually brought on various chorus of monkeys, insects, and other creatures that filled the dense land, each creature stirring about its nightly routine, hunting for food, gathering branches for nests, or interacting with their pack. But tonight, the silence was deafening. Not a single sound came from the darkness tonight. Even the shadows lay still on this ominous night. Dave turned about, listening in for the slightest sound. Nothing. The quiet was unsettling. He was not one to let his nerves get the best of him, but he thought, maybe I should head back to camp. Something doesn't feel... Before he could finish his thought, he heard his name being called. Dave. He spun his head, looking around. His headlight beaming through the trees, nothing to be seen. His heart began to race. He knew he heard his name being called. After a few moments of looking, he calmed himself. I must be hearing things. You really can't spend too much time alone. After reorientating, he continued onward. As he moved through the trees, following his markings, he could not help but think about home. He was supposed to be at his daughter's birthday this weekend, but the photo had come up so suddenly, he had no choice but to go. Besides, with the money he was getting paid by the research lab, he could be set for the rest of his life. Hell, he can even retire after this job. Then he could spend all of his time with his little girl that he treasured so much. I'm gonna have to come up with one hell of a gift idea. Maybe a trip or something for the two of us. She has been bugging me about Disneyland. As he finished speaking, he heard it again. Dave. This time it was much closer, almost as if it were coming from above him. He shot his gaze up and shouted, "Who's there?" His gaze darted around the treetops, looking for the slightest sign of life. Nothing. He could not believe it. There was no way he did not hear that. It was right above him. How? What could have? Who could have? Where did they go? He muttered to himself in shock. After about a minute had passed with him looking up, Dave decided to make the walk back to camp. He did not know what was going on, but what he did know is he didn't like it. Not one bit. The way back to camp was full of thoughts. What was that? In all my years of exploring, I've never had that.
Voices? Voices? Am I a sane person? There has to be a reason.
When he arrived at camp, he uncovered his food box. It was lined with a coating that covered his food scent as to not attract any critters or other animals that he would not want to deal with. He ate his dinner of dehydrated rations and his favorite candy bar. Normally he didn't eat his candy so early into this trip, but it had been a crazy night. Dave needed a little comfort. He crawled into his tent, laid down, and proceeded to drift off to sleep. He awoke suddenly to a sound outside his camp. He shot up, sitting up tall, listening to the sound. It was a sound he was not familiar with, something that did not happen often to Dave. He was very well traveled and experienced. He had heard just about every kind of animal alive, but this sound was different. He cautiously peered out of his tent, shining a light into the distance, trying to catch a glimpse of his intruder. He stepped out slowly, looking in all directions, trying to find what it was that made the sound when suddenly he heard, "Dave."
"Who's there? I have a gun, and I'm not afraid to use it."
His voice straining from the intent. He was shaking. Dave thought for sure he was alone in this jungle. The closest native's village was more than 10 miles upstream. Who else could possibly be here?
"Dave, I know what you seek," the whisper said, coming from deep into the trees. "Follow my voice to find all that your heart desires."
The voice was a raspy tone, a voice that had weathered 100 years, soft and weak, but clear as day. Dave didn't know what to do, but he felt compelled to follow the voice. It was so soothing and so charming, like a bug to a blue light. Against his better judgment, Dave grabbed his gear and walked after the voice. After walking for what seemed like an hour, trudging through the thick tree line, Dave reached a clearing. In the clearing was a small but deep pond. The water was different. It wasn't murky like the rest of the pools of water in the area. This water was silver, almost shiny in its appearance, like a mirror glistening in the glow of the moon. The voice whispered to him,
"Look into the water. It will show you what you seek."
He hesitated.
"How can a pond show me the primates?" "Well, I've come this far. I may as well see this through," he thought.
He walked slowly to the pond. As he arrived on the shoreline, the water became reflective. The pond had a strange light about it, an eerie bluish-silver aura emitted from the water. The light touched out to the tree line, illuminating the immediate area. He leaned over as the water began to wave and move. What he saw was something he had not seen in years. The water became still, and in the reflection of the water he saw his late wife. Dave was shocked and in disbelief of the image staring back at him. How? He thought. She had passed 3 years ago due to a car accident. He was in the car with her and was there for her final moments. There was a pain he had pushed down for so long. It all came bubbling to the surface. He wailed, sobbed, and doubled over next to the water. The image wouldn't leave it. It stayed on the water's surface, a painful reminder of the worst moment of his life. Dave stood up. Looking into the water, he said, "Don't worry, my love. We will be together again soon." Dave began to walk into the water. He walked until his head was fully submerged. There were bubbles for a moment, but soon after his head disappeared, so did the bubbles. As Dave sank into the water, the familiar touch of his wife stung true on his cheek. Her hands clasping his face, her soft brown eyes stared back into his fading blue eyes. He was in disbelief. How could she be here? He did not care. It filled his heart with joy to see her again. She pulled Dave deeper into the water. He hardly noticed that he couldn't breathe. He had accepted his fate. He knew dying would mean he would be with his wife once again. As he sank deeper, he took one final look up to catch his last glimpse of light. His eyes widened. The image on the surface of the water was his daughter. He could see her clear as day, sitting in a room, playing with some of her toys. His mouth fell open as the last air escaped in a large bubble. He looked down at the ghostly figure of his wife. She beckoned him deeper. A deep sadness came over him, one similar to the night he lost his wife. Never did he think he would lose her twice. He gave her one last look and summoned the last of his strength to swim upward. His lungs squeezed tighter and tighter, like a serpent had grabbed hold of his chest. His power was fading. He was drawing closer to the surface, but he couldn't make it any further. His lungs were collapsing in. Then he heard it. The muffled words of his daughter. "Daddy will be home soon. I can't wait to play with him," said the soft, angelic voice of his child. He dug as deep as he could and reached up. His hand broke the surface of the water. It snatched onto a root jetting out of the lake. With everything he had left, he got to the water's edge. Dragging himself out of the water, he gasped for air, and his lungs began to expand. Life and energy began to return to him. After a moment of catching his breath, he snapped to his feet. "I'm coming, honey!" His voice cracked as he began back to his camp, as fast as his feet could carry him. He stumbled over the brush and giant roots that covered the floor of the jungle. He arrived back at camp, following the path of markings he left in the trees. He hurriedly packed up, grabbing only the map of the river systems, enough food to get through the trip, and his notes of the area he had taken. He arrived home late at night. Dave quietly opened the door to his daughter's room. She was sound asleep. He paused for a moment and wiped a tear from his eye. Closing the door softly, he walked back into the living room and grabbed the picture of his wife that he kept on the mantel above the fireplace. He stared longingly into the picture, remembering the beautiful life they had together. Then he placed the picture face down on the table. "It's time to let you go, my love," he said with a trembling voice. Then, from around the corner, a small little voice said, "Daddy," and his daughter walked into the room, rubbing her eyes. A huge smile lit up across his face. He scooped up his baby girl in his arms, and as his heart filled with joy, he held her tight. "I will never let you go," he said sternly. "I will always be here for you. Always."